Okay, Councilman. So we're here today. So introduce you, Doug Harvey, with Councilman for Monroe City Council, District 1. Is that correct?
Correct.
And today we're going to talk about the capital infrastructure tax specifically that is on the ballot for December the 7th. That's up for vote, and it's a tax renewal. It's not a new tax. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So can you kind of give us an idea or just kind of paint a picture of what the tax is? What is this capital infrastructure renewal about?
Yeah. So when you think about like how the city operates and the funding sources, so the city's probably around 80% sales tax, almost 20% property tax, and then there's some minor fees that kind of make up a gap. So it's not just an easy ratio. But for any sales tax that's spent inside the city of Monroe, so there's 2.5% that goes to the general fund, which means that's your normal operating expenses of the city, because everything doesn't just cover with fees. So that's when you think about the city's budget, 77% of it is around employee costs, those kind of things. So just 2.5 cents out of dollar you spend in the city goes towards that. There's another 0.5% that goes to fire and police. So they get an extra paycheck at the end of the year that's strictly for funding that. Then there's 1 cent that goes to capital infrastructure. So when I say, hey, the first 2.5 cents are really like operating expenses of the city, this other piece, the capital infrastructure piece, is like capital improvements. It's whenever you're going from the basic day-to-day maintenance, when you think about that's what the normal everyday stuff is. But the infrastructure piece that we use this tax for is more like, how do we get ahead of some of this deferred maintenance? How do we ultimately put new services, new projects in play? And a lot of it really looks like deferred maintenance. Ultimately, that's what the case is for a lot of cities. So it takes in about $18 million a year annually, and we use that to draw down state and federal funds. So I think the thing that we focus on at the city level is how do we turn one local dollar into $2, into $5, into $7, and this is a big part of that.
And that's due to match funds through state or federal funding that's available or grants.
Exactly. They have capital outlay processes as well. So you'll hear the state talk about capital outlay, and we have projects that we submit as cities, parishes, other municipalities, and then we ultimately, or to a certain extent, making sure that some of our projects really align with their spending mandates, where they're trying to put funding, and we do. And then you have different things at the federal level too, because you had ARPA funds with COVID here a couple of years ago, but then you had, IJT was a version where you had some infrastructure pieces there. And so what we try to do is really make sure our projects really align with those, because there's a lot of multifaceted pieces of this. So like the Civic Center is a great example where, it's a shelter in place scenario for like 3 different parishes. So
Right.
Not only is it an entertainment venue, is a place where you can hold all these events and do this kind of stuff, but it's also a shelter. So that allows us for us to go after different pools of money depending on what use we're going after.
So this tax, when was this tax? Do you have any idea when it was originally put in place?
So it was originally put in place in 1994. It was originally called the street tax because the original intent of it was to pave every street in the city of Monroe, which is ultimately what it did. In 2001, the definition was expanded to where it is today and what is currently on the ballot for now, to where it ultimately goes after infrastructure projects. It can go to public and fire buildings. There's a project right now in my district where there's a repair needed to the fire station, because if we don't do it, the fire truck at some point will not be able to exit that building because of washouts and pipe, for example. So it went from being a street tax to expand the definition that it is today.
So what is the definition of it today?
I would have to get the exact
But just
piece in front of me.
general, what is it?
It's going to be infrastructure. It's going to be public buildings. You can do land purchases. So, for example, we purchased some land about 2 years ago where they're going to put a new bus terminal in.
Okay.
Because the one we have is aged, and it's really going to fit more the multimodal model that we're going with there. So it's for stuff like that.
Okay. Now, when we're talking you said 1994 is when this tax originally. So where was the street? Where was infrastructure dollars coming from? Was it general fund
Yes.
before that?
Yeah, so it seems like, and so it was way before my time, but the feedback to me is that you would ultimately try to bond out small portions of the general fund, which is what a lot of municipalities ultimately do that don't have taxes like this. So you just won't get as big a chunk. You really lean hard into your state funding when you don't have something like this in place.
So why would we consider this a continuation instead of a new tax? I know that it's going to end, and it's not ending this year, correct?
Correct. So this is one of those bonding capacity things. So it ends in 2029, but if I'm going to go bond something out and I'm only can show that, hey, there's only 3 to 4 more
Right.
years of payments, then my ability to bond is severely reduced.
Right.
And that changes your interest rates you get, all that kind of stuff. So that's why, and this is where kind of like lawyers get involved in, like, hey, as a renewal continuance, the best way I can put it is like, you will keep doing what you're doing today. Now,
Right.
if you vote no for it, it rolls off the books and 1 cent goes back into your pocket. That's the alternative to it as well. So it just continues like it does today.
And it's not costing the taxpayers any more money by approving it. Is that correct?
Correct. Essentially, if you approve this tax, then life goes on in 2029 just like it does today.
So let's talk about accountability on the money being spent. I know a lot of governments, and I'm not, pinpointing our government. People say that there's a lot of wasteful spending and things that are out there. What's accountability to say that this money is going to be used for what we say this money is going to be used for?
Yeah, I mean, part of that is, holding your elected officials like myself accountable because, there's plenty of examples of people that are elected and they ultimately spend money on things they shouldn't. I mean, the legislative auditor, even for our state, is a litany of, towns and, parishes that have struggles with this from year to year.
Sure.
I mean, all of our stuff's foiable. I always tell people if you ever want to go down that rabbit hole, I definitely help you if you ever want to go down it. But every 5 years, the city council approves. Essentially, it's a 5-year look forward. So, to kind of go like to where our projects are right now, and the stuff that we spent like in the last 4 years, I'd say like a third is complete, a third is in some form of construction, and a third is in design. So you've always got this backlog of projects that are in some form of development. So every 5 years, when we approve our budget, we also approve this as well. And it says, okay, here's what the 5-year looking forward looks like, and here's where our projects are. So because it's not like if I wanted to make a major infrastructure change, let's say like the water plant. The water plant was many years in the making. It just finished, almost 3 years after we started.
Right.
And it's still got even some additional phases that we may end up doing with that or will end up doing with that. So that part's visible. I tell people like this is a great example of where you see the blue signs. It has the mayor's name on it. It has every council member's name on it. And that's ultimately where that tax is going in your community. So if you see that sign, that's where this tax is. So when you think about, when you get our annual reports and those kind of things, if you go to the city's website, it should be a reflection of your priorities. And ultimately making sure your leaders are connected to that is the biggest part of it.
So how would you recommend the community get involved if they feel like there's some things that are important to them when it comes to infrastructure? What's the best mechanism for the community to voice that?
Yeah, the simplest one I've given out is my phone number is very available. It's 318-243-3499. And I take all kind of calls, for various reasons. And some of it is, hey, I need this fixed, or hey, I would like to see the city do something like that. But, most of us council people are hosting community meetings once or twice a year. There's a lot of public meetings around, some of it's around housing development or whenever there's federal funds that come our way. Some of it they have requirements around like, hey, if you're going to spend this money on lead paint abatement, for example, then you're going to have these public meetings. I would say, stay plugged in with the city. You can always get connected to the news releases. Follow the city's Facebook, mine as well. I use that in my Instagram, really just trying to push as much out. We're always still trying to figure it out because, most of these meetings have tens of people. And, a bunch of us have a bunch of reach, bunch of likes, put out press releases, and we still have 6 or 7 people show up.
Right.
But what I do get a lot of feedback on is when people send me messages. They'll send me texts, they give me calls, and that's the one that I just really lean into because it's been the most effective for me.
When we're looking at priorities within the city, we've got this, let's say the infrastructure passes, and we have this pool of money that is projected to come in based off tax revenue. And we can forecast that out for, 5-10 years. Who determines the priority of how that money is spent?
So ultimately the administration makes a recommendation to council. Council approves the plan. Mr. Warren McAllister, who's over our engineering department, does a great job with this. I mean, ultimately the way we're doing street repairs, for example, we're looking at traffic data. We're really looking at these different legs and like, okay, it's volume dependent, but if you only look at volume, for example, then if you live on the end of a dead end street and there's
Yeah.
only 6 people traveling it, then you're never going to rise to the top. So the way he's doing that and accounting for that with data is really important. We're trying to do the same thing with that, with our piping infrastructures. And hey, where are we continually going through and hitting certain sections because those will ultimately generally deteriorate at the same rate. Because we're a city that does better than most, but because we do have funding mechanisms like this, but you'll have where coupling is connected to a coupling, connected to a coupling.
Right.
I had one poor gentleman in my district who it washed out in his yard so many times. He finally just said, "Hey, I'm not even planting grass again. I know you guys plant the grass on my behalf when it washes out, but I'm just going to wait until the piping's done." And thankfully, we finished that water piping project. It's a distribution project here a couple months
Now,
ago.
do you guys have a 5-year master plan, a master plan that you're working off of, so that where infrastructure is part of that master plan?
Yes. So that 5-year plan I'm describing literally says, okay, here's the Georgia Street pump station, here's the Calypso pump station, here's our local funding, and here's where federal funding is committed. And that's what, because some of them are in the design phase, some of them are still ongoing. The thing that this administration has done a good job with is really breaking these into phases. So Kansas, Garrett, that interchange, it's been a project for 20 plus years. And the reason, that we cut ribbon in that section from 165 to Old Sterlington Road is now being in use. But part of that is because we were able to break it into chunks. And it also demonstrates because the state was a big part of that, is that when you give money to this municipality, then we're able to turn that into project, turn dirt. Because there's a lot of projects where grants are awarded and things like that. And the cities have some struggles with that too, where it didn't really turn into the project. So the next time you go for something, it's like, well, you guys don't spend your money, so why would I bypass this other worthy cause for somebody who's not be able to do something with it? So cutting it into phases is a big part of
I
that
remember
too.
when they shut down the golf course there at the airport because they had to for it. But I mean, how many years has that been before
Right.
we've seen movement in that area?
Yeah, so that was just speaking of that one to give a general update. We had that one expecting to bid out like it was last fall, but whenever they decided they're going to 6-lane the interstate there, it kind of got wrapped into that project. So I'm hoping that one's actually 2 years away over the rail ramp there and everything like that. So that's one, because I've also served on the I-20 board as well, but it's one I'm still actively watching and wanting to see come to fruition.
So, as a council member, advocating for your district, as each one of the council people should be advocating for their district, but understanding there's a larger goal that have to maintain. How are you able to deliver information to your constituents saying that I know this road is bad, I know it needs to be fixed, it's on the list, but I've got, in this district, they need to be taken care of too. How do you manage that?
For me, the best thing is just to be upfront about it. Like, hey, this is where we are, and the risk. I mean, because to me, it's really easy for me to just look at the city as a whole. I'm an engineer by trade. That's been kind of my thing. So, I mean, I just look at it as the whole system. Kind of like sewer, for example. If we go invest in sewer in South Monroe, where there's ultimately these major trunk lines, that's an investment that has impact that affects the north side of Monroe. For example, we had a project about 2.5 years ago where we weren't able to approve a housing development because we could not provide sewer knowing what was going on downstream. So we did all the zoning changes and all that kind of stuff. So that investment that happens in a different district ultimately benefits the whole city, and not just my district. It's
Sure.
not just to make sure District 1 has sewer access, but it's one that helps the whole body. Now, when we're talking about like roads and striping and those kind of things, it's just important to say, hey, here's where you are. Because what somebody doesn't want to hear is like, yes, I'm going to look into that for you. Then they have to ask me in 3 months, ask me in 5 months. And it's just important to be realistic because there's always more needs than money.
Sure.
And so I think
and that'll never go away.
That'll never go away, exactly. And I think for us as a council, knowing that we're not just in District 1, or because like my district, for example, is primarily residential, but they work all over the city. I live in District 1, I work in District 3, and it goes like that all across town. So it's important to know that it's all interconnected and just really thinking about the whole. And when you can articulate that vision, you can generally get people to buy in.
When the administration started putting out the true trouble that we had with water and sewer infrastructure within the city, roads we can see. We can feel, we drive down and we can see if they're bad or if they're good. But the sewer and the water, you can't see that, and you don't feel the impact unless it's directly affecting you.
That's right.
But the neglect that we've had for whatever reason, I mean, there's no reason to play the blame game, but for whatever reason, infrastructure with our sewers, especially, had been neglected for many years. And I'm sure it came down to trying to prioritize the best things, triage things with the money that you have. But the investment just in sewer alone is probably exceeded what the administration ever thought we would have to spend out of the chunk of money we have to deal with right now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and we've seen, we're like everybody else. We've seen the real inflation pain. Projects that were, 5 million projects in 2019 or $10 and $12 million projects now. So not only was it deferred then, now it's just twice as much. That's a real thing that we see whenever we're evaluating. And you asked a question about, how do we make sure, hey, money's wasted, things like that. Everything that government does costs more. It's more painful. It's just there's more. I'm getting to all the reasons why that is. So, but to me, that's also why you have to address it as early as you reasonably can, because if it gets to the point where I have to it becomes more invasive, that cost factor that's already higher, it's going to be even worse. But yeah, I mean, deferred maintenance is just a painful thing. I mean, we see it all over the country from, the Flints of the world and what happened there. And, we've been fortunate. We came through a time where there was money to draw down. There was, you have something like this tax that's a big part of that. Because that was the one thing that I didn't really know, or I didn't know, and then I didn't really appreciate until I got on council was like, okay, how do you really stack up your funding sources like this? Because since 2001, that was my first year on council, the first year of the new administration. And since 2001, we spent $120 million on projects. So if I collect $18 million a year, that's $72 million. So where's the gap at? And essentially the point that the extra that we drawed in, and that's from the state and federal matches, and really being able to pull that in. Our local delegation for state level, federal delegation, Julia Letlow's definitely been a friend of this community and helping with that Stand Up for Trump line.
I think it's just impressive. This is John Ray and myself were having a conversation yesterday about how fortunate we are to have state officials and federal officials that are really paying attention to Northeast Louisiana. And I think a lot of that has to do with our relationship that we have with those officials, state and federal, that I feel like for the first time in a long time, we're getting noticed. And we're not being left behind and watching everybody else get things. And it's a good feeling to be able to have up here. I don't know if you're experiencing the same.
Yes, for sure. I mean, each year we as a council go to D.C. and we essentially go lobby for projects, and, think about where we're at right now with, depending on where you live in Monroe, with the congressional district changes, your House representative is potentially the Speaker of the House.
Right.
And if you think about, Scalise being number 2, you have Julia sitting on appropriations. I mean, those different things to have Louisianians that really in positions to where they can really move the needle. And, Julia went in, and went into appropriations pretty early. I mean, that's an incredible committee to be a part of, and it really speaks to what she brought to the table. And as far as our local delegation, I'm always proud to work with those guys. And, you think about like the biomedical research park and things like that they've ultimately turned into reality. I mean, it's really exciting to be a part of.
Well, I mean, we definitely notice on the ground level as just citizens here, in which I'm not able to vote for this tax. I do not live in the city limits of Monroe, but it affects me. I work there. It's my livelihood. Ouachita Parish, Monroe, I mean, we're the hub for Northeast Louisiana, and what we do impacts the whole region. And I just want people to understand that although we want to protect our neighborhoods, we want to make sure we have the best streets, we also have to look at the whole area, because if we're just focused on one little piece, we're going to miss so much more. So speaking on that, so let's talk about opposition to this. I have heard and I've seen some press conferences where there is a little bit of opposition to this, and I'd like to kind of get your take on that, as unbiased as you can, to kind of speak to what is some of the opposition, what is some of the misconceptions that we're hearing, and maybe can kind of clear it up or be able to create the dialogue where others can engage to ask additional questions.
Yeah, the street tax part of it has been brought up a handful of times. Like, hey, this was originally for streets, and I have plenty of streets that are challenging too. I mean, whether my district, no matter which district you're in, it's no matter which part of Louisiana I go in, we have that, and it makes it sound like we're taking away from the street money in order to make this tax happen, and which we talked about originally. The original intent was to pave the streets. So as its original intent was done, that's when the language changed, which was the natural evolution of that tax. Because I can tell you of all the things that we're concerned about. I mean, sewer is the one that keeps me up at night. I mean, we have, takes a standard for as far as it being completely, or some sections that were almost completely closed off. There were some that's, 30, 40, 60% during that section. That's for 2 miles. And that's the one that I think about the most. I mean, because we have a first-rate water plant.
And it concerns me the most, too. And a lot of people, so with my line of work, selling real estate, if you don't have functioning sewer, you don't have development. Development cannot happen without sewer. Economies, believe it or not, are built on the back of your functioning sewer system.
Right.
You can have water and power, but if you don't have sewer, you're not going anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, the way this tax is structured, and it's also been kind of made to sound like this is a new expanded definition of the tax, and this definition's been there since, I think it's 2001, 2002.
So the definition, nothing is changing.
Definition, nothing's changing. It's just like it is. So there's some little bit of misinformation on that or misunderstanding around it, but it's also important to be flexible. So let's say you wanted it to be 70% streets. So whenever Monroe went under consent decree in the early 2000s, you had 2 options. You could either do it with a tax like this, go back and ask for an additional tax, or you had to put it to the ratepayers. So all of a sudden your sewer rate triples or something. So this tax helped us do that while also funding other projects as well. So it's important to have a reflection of what your current needs are, because your needs should be changing over time. The things that we should be working on 4 years from now should be completely different from today, or at least be this ever-evolving pie chart that has different slices. And so I think that's important. It gives you the flexibility to change that. And, for us as a council, that 5-year plan is a current reflection of our priorities. Every year we renew it. It's what ultimately goes in the development queue, because it's not really easy to just turn on a dime for that.
Right.
So that's where, when people are worried about intended use and things like that, I say, look at our 5-year plan. And even for the council, it's like, hey, if we have challenges with it, then we make sure that plan reflects our priorities. Because I was told a long time ago, if you show me where you spend your money, show me your budget, and I'll show you what you care about.
Right. What you care about can actually change depending on what's actually happened at that time. I mean, we could have a main line collapse or burst, and we're having to reprioritize. Would you agree with that?
Agreed. I mean, it's one of those things of, strong conviction is loosely held. Yeah. I mean, when things change, when you have new data, you say, hey, this is a new problem. This is, for example, I was going to look at a project with the city engineer last week, and asked him where this was, and he says, well, hey, actually, we got this going on over here on Thomas, and so that's just how, as you discover things, you're going to ultimately, your priorities should change, because we all have this list of priorities, and that's something that I think every person in this city probably knows, but probably don't hear it said out loud, is if no matter which street I live on in the city, and if you told me to write down the top 10 things I cared about, I could put that list all over the city and probably look pretty similar. The thing that would be different is the order they're in, depending on what street you live on, what your current life situation, all those kind of things. So it's okay for that list to move up and down. And if I live on this street, then if I had flooding in 2016, then all of a sudden, I really care about stormwater pumps. But if I've got this huge pothole that feels like it chatters my teeth every time I leave my driveway, then the streets are there.
Sure.
So it's important just to keep getting that feedback, coalescing it, and ultimately letting that be a reflection of the priorities of the council and the citizens.
Why not raise the tax?
I think that, ultimately especially we're in this a session right now where the state tax is potentially going to go up even higher. I mean, we're the highest sales tax in the country as a state. So asking for more I just don't think it's the right answer. Plus, it's actually a little challenging to deploy capital too. I mean, there's a certain point, like we get 18 million a year. Let's say you got 3 times that or 5 times that. Your ability to deploy it effectively changes too, and that's something that I've learned being on the private sector. I think at this mix, it's something that we can deploy once we think about like how the other matches and stuff come in. I would think that this is more like a steady as she goes approach, and keep going after big swings with federal and state, so that you can kind of also just get chunks as well.
So let's back up a little bit. So you're saying, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. So if we had an increase in capital, it would be harder to deploy. Is that because we're trying to maximize every dollar so that we can get matching funds for those dollars?
That's part of it. The other part of it is your contractor base. It's your existing city overhead that supports it, your project engineers and things like that. If I gave them 3 times as much capital, then I would have to add some additional support there. We use mostly local design firms to support. There will come a point then if you do that, then you have to pull people further and further in.
Okay.
Ultimately increases your cost.
Right.
That was something that I kind of learned early on in my, I won't say early on in my career, but once I was in the project management and capital deployment phase, that there was a number at which some of the companies I've worked for that we actually weren't very efficient at deploying.
Interesting. Never really thought of it that way. Let's talk about community involvement. How do we encourage the community to be able to get involved, to ask the questions so that they can be informed on what they're actually voting on? How do we get the community involved to effectively say, yes, we approve it, or no, we don't? How do we get them out of the house to the polls?
Yeah, I mean, this is an election that's going to be a low turnout election. Just there's not any people on the ballot. There's like 4 state constitutional amendments and then our part of the tax call. And so it's just a low turnout one. That's usually when you have somebody going around, they're just more active. It's just different kinds of races. But yeah, it's an important thing, I think, is just getting people to understand. I mean, because most people, when I have this conversation, like, okay, what is the capital infrastructure tax? Well, is it going to cost me more money? How does it impact my life? And some people get really in the weeds, and I appreciate both sides of it, because some people really want to talk about, like, well, hey, what happened to this project on Jackson Street? Or, okay, well, let me look that one up, because there's some I can recite off the top of my head, but there's some I can't as well. But ultimately, it's their money. It's my money, your money, their money, money that's spent here, and they should be involved. I encourage people. There are discussions on Facebook. There are the community meetings. We just did a couple of them leading into this cycle, where we're just kind of going through, telling people what's going on, and and I'm talking about this tax as well, and just
Sure.
what that looked like. I mean, everybody. Somebody told me this once upon a time, and I've always tried to remember it. Is that a lady told me, everybody should have one topic that keeps them up at night at least once every 2 weeks, and for me, that is really just about this community, the growth of this community. How do I create a world where I have kids from 20 to 12 years old? How do I create a world where they want to stay here?
Right.
And that's the thing I think about. And I would encourage somebody to find, any person that's really wondering, to find what that is, whether it's their local church, whether it's something going on in their community inside their local neighborhood, or if it's something at the municipal level, and how do I make sure my funds are being spent, or how do I make sure this is being served appropriately, and just get connected. Because most of the local officials that I work with, even at state level, they're very open. They're really put themselves out there, and we don't always agree, because
Sure.
even this morning I had somebody that's talking on Facebook, and there's something we disagree on, and it's okay to say, hey, I do disagree on where this is.
But the important thing is that we are able to have the dialogue.
For sure.
And I think for many people, the political climate has gotten such that we forget that it's okay for us to talk, and it's okay for us to disagree, but we should be able to talk about it, right?
Agreed.
And I think this is one of those issues that there are some difference of opinions that are out there. I don't fully understand those who may have some opposition to it, of what their ultimate opinions are. But I would encourage anybody to listen to this. If they'd like to know that, contact all of the city council members and be able to hear all sides of it so you can then make an informed decision. I'd rather somebody vote completely opposite of how I vote, but they feel like they're informed and they're engaged and they're going to cast their vote than for someone to disagree with me and stay at home.
For sure.
I think we need to have a vibrant, thriving community. We need actively engaged citizens to be able to build it the way we want it, not the way Brian wants it, not the way Doug wants it, but the way we collectively as a group want this community to move forward. And I think if more of us show up to the polls, we're going to get to see really clearly what our community really wants and what we stand up for. Even though we know this is going to be a low turnout, it doesn't have to be a low turnout.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I go back to it should ultimately just be a reflection of the population.
Yep.
That's the core piece of voting. And I'll poll my Facebook audience for stuff sometimes. We had a thing like, hey, we're going to do this road project. Would you like to do one lane closed? All this kind of stuff. And a lot of times I'm just wrong. I mean, I think, well, sure, I know what I would like. I want the simplest, basic version, rip the Band-Aid off. But I was overwhelmingly defeated in my poll. And so that's what it reflected. And so and there's a lot of stuff that's 50-50. I tell people that, if I can ever get 60-40 on any kind of thing, I feel like I've really won and really found a nerve. And so, yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think all of us as public servants are just trying to find a way to support the people that live in our neighborhoods and really just be a reflection of that, because there's times where I vote on something and it's just like, sometimes I think I'm doing the right thing, and, where sometimes I am getting some opposition. Other times I'll vote on something that does not quite align with Doug Harvey, the individual, but I know it aligns with Doug Harvey's constituents.
And that's important for people to know that about you, and I appreciate you saying that, because as a leader or representative in a community, I think that's important, that sometimes you are going to have to set your will aside and do the will of the people. I don't think you should have to give up, your principles on anything, but I do believe that an elected official should do the will of the people, even if it's opposite to what they would like to see done for themselves. So thanks for bringing that up, Doug. Thanks for reaching out to be able just to have this open discussion. And I would encourage anyone who's listening, no matter if you agree with what Doug is saying or you disagree, I want to encourage as many people as possible to get out, if this is within your area voting in the city limits of Monroe for this tax, just go out there and vote. If you're still unsure, Doug gave out his phone number. We'll post it in the show notes. And then I know all the other council members would be more than happy, whether you're in their district or not, be able to give you their point of view on this. I just want to see engaged people get out and go vote. What is it, December the 7th?
Yeah, so early voting's November 22nd through the 30th, so it goes through this upcoming Saturday. Thursday and Friday are not voting days, and then December 7th will be in your local polling location. Right now, early voting is the registrar of voters.
Awesome. Now we kind of got that out. Personal privilege, I'm going to ask another question. How did the results come out on, because I haven't heard, y'all may have announced it, on the North 6 bike lane? I haven't ever heard an update on that. Y'all may have published one, but I just, inquiring minds want to know.
We started to talk about it, and we covered it during some of the community meetings a week or two ago, but that's ultimately our plan is to move forward with converting it to one lane. We've got a lot of feedback, and I've had some people that are vehemently against it, I have people that are just vehemently for it. And most of the feedback we got was just a little bit over the line for going the bike lane, or the bike pedestrian lane route. And it was really, when you think about that, the Garden District neighborhood, that group was, I would say, overwhelmingly in support of it. There's still some, even this morning on Facebook, I was having conversations there. There's a vocal minority there too, and depending on who you ask, who was stronger in that. But we're going to go forward with it. That's the plan.
I think it's great. It slows traffic down, I think, a little bit. For those homeowners that live on that street, I think it's going to enhance the quality of life for them and for that overall area. So I'm glad to hear that you guys are looking to move forward with that. I think that's a great move.
Yeah, it's one of those things to where, like, I've said, hey, I didn't have a strong opinion. I always liked them. I mean, I'm a cyclist. I'm a runner. I personally like it, but really, that's not where I live. So I really lean harder into the ones that actually live in that neighborhood. That's That's my default position on that. I think that there's enough pushback that I think that the community's still going to be has to. They're probably going to be a little slower to embrace it, but I'll point them towards West Monroe and ask them, what they did with their bike lanes, and they went through a really similar cycle where they were getting a lot of pushback in the beginning, and enough where it was like almost like a 50-50 issue, kind of like depending on which group you were talking to, how we felt with this one. But if you look over there now, people have really embraced those lanes.
Absolutely, really embraced them, and it's assimilated with it. I mean, it's kind of bringing a sense of community back where you're seeing people walking more on the sidewalks that are now being refurbished and redone. You're seeing people riding bikes more on those lanes. Traffic does slow down a little bit, but none of the stuff that they've done in West Monroe has built any congestion whatsoever.
And that was the thing that when we looked at and we had the traffic data for is that the traffic did slow down by about 2 to 3 miles per hour, depending on what section you were in. And we just didn't see any congestion. That was the thing. And, that's the part that I keep going back to. If all things are equal, and I think if, it's kind of like today, if you had a blank slate, would you put a 2-lane road there? That's always like the core thing that comes to mind. But yeah, I'm hoping that ultimately this is a reflection of what the feedback we've gotten so far.
Well, I think pro bike lane north 6.
I think it's a step in the right direction. Yeah. It was, like I said, I know my bias, so I try to take my bias out and just really listen to the citizens that are really living in around that street, in that neighborhood.
Well, Doug, I know your time's valuable. I appreciate you spending a little bit of it with us today. And again, I'll say it again to people, please go vote. Early voting is November
22nd through 30th.
Okay.
And election day is December 7th.
Yeah. Get out and vote, people.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you for taking the time to watch or listen to this podcast. We really appreciate your involvement. Please leave us a comment, or even better yet, subscribe to this podcast and hit that notification bell so that you can be alerted for every new episode when it hits.